You've got a problem. Let's say that you want to carry out a systematic review, and let's also say that you're interested in doing that on a complex intervention like pediatric weight management. Well, let's say you've gathered all the detail, on the outcomes, intervention, samples, study characteristics, etc., but you find that the heterogeneity between the studies is so high that you simply can't meaningfully talk about, much less calculate, a single effect size. What do you do? Well, commonly, you could do something like, compute a pooled effect size anyway and just wish away the heterogeneity. That is, pretend you're saying something meaningful when you know you really aren't. Not a good way to go. You could also try to do a whole raft of subgroup analyses or meta-regressions. But for problems that I'll show you in a little bit, that's not such a great idea always either. Or alternatively, you could just give up the hope of any quantitative analysis and go with a narrative review. Or you could try something different. So let me show you what we're going to do by way of example. Let's start with a question, does a pediatric weight management intervention that includes 2-hour weekly aerobic sessions do better in terms of producing whatever our outcomes are than an intervention that does not? Or more generally, we could say, does a pediatric weight management intervention that includes X, whatever the intervention component is, do better than an intervention that doesn't include that component? Now, let's think about why that question is so hard to answer. In real life, a pediatric weight management program includes many more components than just our aerobics program. For instance, we know that there are several different nutrition dietary components, several different activity components, behavioral interventions, and then counseling approaches. So let's just walk through an example. Let's say that there are 16 different intervention characteristics or components that we're gathering information on. And so here you see I've just got this little grid, and each one of those circles with a number in it corresponds to some component. Like for instance, motivational interviewing, including a calorie deficit, our aerobics program. And let's say that the red circles indicate an intervention component is absent. So in this particular study, whatever the intervention component, 4, 7, 9, 14, 15, those are all missing. But the blue indicate that the intervention component, for instance, like say goal setting or something, is present. Well, we can think of the whole combination of specific intervention components as an intervention mix. So a treatment arm really can be conceived of as a mix of different intervention components. Well, now imagine that we had 12 different interventions, 12 different arms, and they all mixed and matched the 16 components in different ways. Okay, so if we were going to draw a picture of it, it might look something like this. And let's say that we wanted to combine this set of intervention mixes into groups that were alike. Remember, you can see that there's a lot of heterogeneity. How could we manage that? Well, we could, sort them into groups. We could try, say, matching intervention mixes on a single component. Let's say whether component 16, okay, was present or not. So we shift this one over to this side, over there, we do some mixing and matching, and sure enough, we've got two general types of intervention mixes, right? They're all consistent in terms of the ones on the left, all the different arms on the left are missing whatever component 16, that could be our aerobics component, and all the ones on the right include those. But what would this really tell us? I mean, the intervention mixes within each of those types, each green box, are still pretty different. And just look at the box on the left. I mean, in what sense could we say that the two interventions in the red circle are really the same? In fact, they're completely different except for that one component we were focusing on. And there's another problem. Let's say that we try to group intervention mixes based on all the different possible combinations of our intervention components. Well, with 16 different intervention components, we would have 65,536 different possible combinations of those components. And that's far, far too many intervention mixes to manage, say if we were going to try to do these sort of subgroup analyses or something like this. And for the pediatric weight management evidence analysis that we carried out, we collected data on 30 different intervention components. Um, just, in case you're wondering, that's over 1 billion different possible combinations of intervention components. So, what did we do? Well, first, we turned a complex combinatorial problem, how you mix and match all of those different intervention components, into a simple map problem. Then we used a little theory and previous research to help us figure out what that map was telling us. And then we formulated some hypotheses. And you're probably thinking, a map? You mean like a city map? Well, yeah, actually, a whole lot like a city map. So you may be wondering, how on earth would a map help us identify groups of similar interventions, similar intervention mixes? Well, think about how we normally, or consider how we normally think about a map. People don't live evenly distributed across an entire area. They tend to cluster in certain areas. So for the map of Manhattan on our left, we may find that the population density, that is, is higher up there by Central Park. There are more people living in this area. And there may be fewer people living, kind of southeast of that. Also, people who live in one part of the city tend to be similar. Okay, so for instance, on the Upper East Side, you may have older, wealthier individuals tend to cluster there. Whereas, people in Queens may tend to share another set of characteristics, be immigrants, working class, things like that. And what's important is that we could ask different questions about people who live in different areas of the map. For instance, we could ask the question, do people who live on the Upper East Side make more money than people who live in Brooklyn? Or do people in Staten Island tend to have higher rates of obesity than people who live in Jersey City? Then we could just gather data and answer our question. So let's imagine that we could make a map of pediatric weight management interventions where the intervention mixes in one part of the map would be similar. That is to say, they would share several different characteristics, and they would be similar to intervention mixes in another part of the map. Well, and that's precisely what we did. We used a statistical technique to reduce all of those differences in intervention components to just a couple of different dimensions. So each separate component mix, that is, all the combination of intervention components that make up the arm of a study, would have a value on each of those dimensions. Then we can simply map those dimensions onto a two-dimensional graph. And here's what that map looks like. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things. First, the intervention mixes are not evenly distributed across all possible configurations in the same way that people are not evenly distributed across a geographic area. They tend to cluster in certain areas. In other words, there are empty spaces. So even though we had over 1 billion possible configurations in real life, that is to say, in the data that we had from all the studies we drew on, there were many fewer real-life combinations. And we can think of this area as the intervention space. Now, second, another important fact is that the intervention mixes that fall close together on the map within our intervention space tend to be more alike than intervention mixes that fall far apart. So all of those arms, those intervention mixes that fall, say, down in that lower left-hand area, those tend to be more alike. But if we were going to compare, say, an intervention mix or arms that are very far apart within our intervention space, we know that those would tend to be very different in terms of the way that those interventions are built. That is to say, the different components that make them up. And just as you can have someone with any particular characteristic live in any part of the city, say, over 75, they can live in all over the different parts of the city, right? We could also have any particular characteristic intervention, a characteristic like our aerobic training, show up in any part of our intervention space. But what you see is that interventions that share many similar characteristics tend to end up close together in that intervention space. But you may be thinking, it's great and all that we're able to reduce that unmanageable complexity to a couple of different dimensions, but where are the groups in this thing? Well, that's what we wondered too. So we used another procedure called hierarchical cluster analysis to identify groupings within our intervention space. And so where are the clusters of intervention mixes that tend to be alike? Let me show you. Here's what we found. There were 3 clusters or groups of intervention mixes that tended to be more alike based on a range of different intervention components that we gathered intervention on. So not similar just based on this or that component, but on a whole range of components. And now we have to ask, we see that they kind of cluster in these different areas, but what do those different clusters mean? In other words, what are the combination of components that tend to show up in these different types of intervention mixes? Well, in order to find this out, we then ran a series of bivariate analyses to find out the likelihood that each intervention component, say, reduced calorie diet or aerobics, intervention, would show up in different clusters, which, we're calling these intervention mix types. This helped us to identify the main characteristics of 3 intervention mix types. One type tended to have both diet and behavioral interventions, but with more detail on the diet interventions. Another type tended to have both diet and behavioral interventions, but with a little bit more detail on the behavioral interventions. And then there was one type that tended to be missing either diet or behavioral interventions or both. So we asked ourselves, does it make any sense to analyze these 3 groups or types separately, or are 2 of the intervention mix types similar enough that it would make sense to combine them? And this is where we drew on the previous research and pediatric weight management guidelines to give us some help. We knew from the work on the previous pediatric weight management guidelines that multi-component programs were preferred over single component programs. That is to say, a single component program that would, or intervention that would include only diet or only exercise or only behavioral interventions. So we knew that it made more theoretical and practical sense to combine the multi-component intervention mix types. This gave us 2 intervention mix types for our analysis. Because the types of intervention components that tended to appear in one, we called it, and this is the green one, right, the multi-component intensive intervention type. We called the other group of interventions the missing or no intervention type. Now, you might be wondering, couldn't a particular component, say our diet intervention or using a balanced macronutrient diet, still show up in the missing or no component group? Well, sure it could, but it's not likely. In fact, we calculated just how likely each of the major intervention components was to show up in one of our intervention mix types versus the other. So we see here that once we have calculated basically the risk of any particular component appearing in the multi-component intensive treatment, we see that basically anything above that red line there is much more likely to occur in the intensive intervention. So we see that in some cases it's much higher. In the case of several specific diet components, physical activity, behavioral, and also who the components are delivered by. And below the line, those are interventions or intervention components that are much less likely to occur in the intensive intervention. So in the end, we have 2 groups of intervention component mixes that we can now ask questions about. For instance, we could say, are BMI outcomes different between our 2 groups? Now, we can't say that this or that particular component is the cause for these outcomes, and in fact, we wouldn't want to, because we know that it's not this or that particular intervention component that brings about the weight improvements in weight status in children and adolescents, but rather it's the real life combinations. And that's what this analysis allows us to look at.